My talk today is on women on top, rehauling perceptions of women in Islamic history and tradition. Maybe a little bit more about myself. I'm a historian by training, and I look at pre-colonial Southeast Asia and also looking at Islam, women, gender, and so my talk today will be, in a way, divided into two parts. The first part will really be looking at the Quran and Hadith, the sayings of the Prophet, because I think it's quite important for us to look at the texts to understand issues about women. And then the second part of my talk will be looking at history, the experiences of women in Islamic history and tradition. I've given you all some references, but I'm not too sure whether anyone has been able to get your hands on some of the books and read something, and you have some background knowledge of the talk. Maybe show of hands, has anyone sort of been able to look at some of the references? No, okay. Oh, at least one. All right, good. So the other thing is, I'm not, because the audience here is very diverse, and I'm not too sure whether my talk will sort of is pitched at the right way. Hopefully not too complicated and also not too simple. I try to pitch it that way. But if it is, please do ask me questions and try to clarify some of the issues. Okay, I think I'll go right in and start the talk. First of all, I would like to begin with quote. The idea of culture has increasingly become a core component of politics and common sense. Muslims are presented as a threatening culture, the most homogenized and troubling of the rest. Muslim women, in this new common sense, symbolize how alien this culture is. And this quote is from Lila Abu Lughod, a Palestinian-American professor, who has written many books on women and gender. And this quote is taken from Do Muslim Women Need Saving? I think most of us will understand and will be able to see that, especially after 9/11, the discourse on Islam has taken center stage. And I think one of the major issues which is highly contested, which is very highly debated, is the issue on women, the women question. Although these issues are very, very complex, and I think if you look at women issues in terms of laws on polygamy, for example, gender segregation, women in the domestic sphere, and women in politics, in power, and in leadership position, which are very much needed to be interrogated from the lens of power, from the lens of culture, history, and tradition, but unfortunately, they are very much discoursed in very simplistic and very reductive ways. So, although the women situation in Islam and women in general are very diverse, very heterogeneous, and you can talk about Muslim women and Muslim women's experiences from sort of Southeast Asia to Central Asia, East Asia, Europe, Middle East, of course, very diverse. But in the Western imaginary and in the media, for example, what you get will be generally quite popular images of women which are represented in this manner. Women are seen as, very much cloaked, secluded. Muslim women are generally seen as subordinated to men, oppressed. And these are the more popular images of women. And generally, I think this kind of popular images, this kind of discourses on Islam are really not helped by Muslims themselves, because if you look at a certain dominant group of Muslims, a very vocal Muslim group, maybe a small group, but very vocal and dominant, and their interest and their desire to establish Islamic states in most countries. And what they wanted to do also is to implement Sharia law in these states. And unfortunately, the understanding of Sharia law is also very one-sided. It is very reductive. And unfortunately, the understanding of Sharia law is very much punitive measures. For example, the hudud law, and also how to control women. So unfortunately, if you look at the understanding of a certain understanding of Sharia, for example, which is very much authoritarian and dominant, these are unfortunately the images that you see in most Muslim states. So the problem is the rising dominant discourse on women in general, Muslim women, is very much based on this understanding of one interpretation of Islam, which is very much an absolutist interpretation of Islam, and also unfortunately, it is being taken as an authoritative and authoritarian understanding of how Muslim women should react, how Muslim women should dress, and what are the roles and positions of women. So generally, unfortunately, this kind of absolutist Sharia seeks to impose a very ahistorical, absolutist, and unfortunately hegemonic reading and understanding of the Quran and Hadith, the sayings of the Prophet, which has resulted in reductive understanding of Sharia, where Sharia has become almost synonymous with hudud and control of women, resulting in asymmetrical power relations favoring men at the expense of women, resulting in discriminatory state and institutional policies on women, where women are limited in many spheres, be it domestic, public, legal, and also political. And this is very much nourished by the media and the understanding of this kind of binaries about women, where negative images of Muslim women in Muslim states are found, and also in the West. So my talk today actually proposes that these reductive images and these discourses of Muslim women by both the West and by Muslims themselves must be interrogated. They must be integrated in two ways. I think one, you need to look at it from the view and from the lens of the Quran and the Hadith themselves, the sources of law of Muslim societies. And the other, I think we need to look at Muslim history, Muslim tradition, whereby the experiences of women and how men and women have interpreted the Quran and the Hadith are actually very, very diverse. So first of all, I will start off with the Quran. Why? Where does this understanding of women being subordinated to men, women generally very much secluded, or in the domestic sphere, or I think what my research basically concerns about women in politics and women in power, whereby women are generally, in Islam, are seen to be forbidden to be on top, forbidden to take up leadership positions, whether in politics or whether in the religious sphere. Perhaps we could first go right to the beginning of the origin of humanity. I think that would be quite useful. Here we should be looking at the role of Hawa and how this has been very much interpreted in Muslim history, Muslim tradition, and also some believe that it is part of the Quran. In fact, if you look at the origin of Hawa in terms of women being created out of Adam's rib, and therefore women were part of men, and therefore naturally subordinated to men, This was not found in the Quran, but the philosopher, the jurists, and the exegete, Fakir al-Din al-Razi, Death 1210, emphasized this biblical literary motive of women's creation from Adam's rib, which is very much a Christian tradition, and placed it in sort of the understanding of Hawa in the Muslim tradition. So I think we need to interrogate this, because this has been very much used and justified by men that women are in subordinate position because biologically they are created from Adam's rib. So if you look at it in the Quran, if you look at it in the verse on the creation of humanity, the origin of humanity, the verse states, "O humankind, be careful of your duty to your Lord who created you from a single soul." Single soul, nafs wahida, which means it is from one soul. It is not creating Adam first and then creating women from Adam's rib. And from it created its mates, and from them the two have spread abroad a multitude of men and women. And this verse and the understanding that women and men are created from a single soul, single nafs, are also found in other verses in the Quran, for example, 698, 7189, 3128, and 39.6. So I think it's very important for us to interrogate this idea first, and perhaps question the whole understanding of the creation of Hawa in the first place. Next, I would like to go to another verse. This verse has been very much quoted by most people to justify the subordinated position of women in Islam, and also the fact that women are not allowed to be leaders of men. So, for example, this verse, Quran Al-Nisa 4:34, it states, "Men are kawamun." And this is where the translation is very, very problematic, because the translation is contested. So, kawamun could mean upholders, could mean managers, could mean guardians, could mean a few things. But generally, men are kawamun over women because God had preferred some of them over others, and because of what they spend of their wealth. Virtuous women are qanitat, virtuous. They are devoutly obedient, guarding in absence what God has guarded. As for those from whom you fear discord and animosity, reprimand them, banish them to their beds and strike, avoid them. Ad-daraba. And if they obey you, then do not misbehave towards them at all. Indeed, God is majestic and great. So this verse has been taken by Muslims and non-Muslims to show that, Islam is very problematic. You see, men are above women. But if you look at the exegetes and the interpretation of this Quran, and I think this is a problem. How do men interpret words of God? And I think that is in itself is a very complex situation. But here, if you look at early classical exegetes, for example, this is where I have did a study on the different exegetes, and you can see the interpretation of this verse is very, very diverse and contested as well. So if you look at, for example, Al-Wahidi, Al-Razi, Al-Qurtubi, Ibn Kathir, they take on a very expansive understanding of women here in terms of women's role is generally subordinated to men in all spheres. But if you look at another group of exegetes and philosophers and jurists, for example, Muqatil, the early exegete from the 8th century down to the early 20th century and now to the 21st century, these scholars interpret the verse in a much more restrictive manner. So let me go back to the verse. Here, most of those who interpret this in a restrictive manner see that this is particularly in the context of the domestic. it is in the context of marriage, whereby women are guardians over women, and men are guardians because of the money that they bring to the home, and because they are the breadwinners of women. So that's one. And the other point is the understanding of qanitat, devout women. It is really talking about women who are religiously devout to God, and women who preserve their chastity and preserve what God has asked them to guard. And here, for those women, all right, who would perhaps bring discourse, and this is where I would say that this is very problematic, and that's why the role of women is very contested. For those who fear discord, or for those women who the men think would create disharmony in the family or create discord in the family, men are asked to do a few things, a few steps before women are being sort of advised and then taken into sort of tasks. And this is where the exegetes and the scholars contest the word daraba. For most, the dominant exegetes or the dominant scholar, they will say, beat them. But most of the exegetes talk about how do you beat. So for most of the exegetes and scholars, they will say that beating of women is not allowed, but if you beat them, it is more like a beating of the knuckle, and it is just to reprimand. So it is just a light beating for you to reprimand someone. So it is not about beating at all. And if you look at the latter exegetes, if you look at the word daraba, and you see it as the word adraba, that means just isolate them. It is not even beating. But the understanding of most of this, the understanding of this word, of this verse, mostly is the understanding of beating. So that is unfortunate, and that is something that we need to question and we need to interrogate as well. So if you look also at the exegetes who have interpreted this in a more sort of expansive manner, and this is where you have, Al-Wahidi, Razi, Qurtubi, and Ibn Kathir. What happened is that they have taken this context out of the marriage context or the domestic context to other spheres, to a wider context, be it political, legal, social. And not only that, for some of them, it is not so much functional superiority, whereby men is over women because of the money that they spend, but it is because of biological reasons, is because of ontological reasons, that man, has been created over women, and that man is stronger, more intelligent, they have more, credibility, and therefore they should by right be the leaders of men. And yet, if you look at the latest sort of interpretation, exegetes on this particular topic, this particular verse, for example, Fazlur Rahman, Khalid Abu Fadil, Muhammad Sharur, and Abu Zaid, for example, they argue that the functional reason for men being over women is not even just the fact that men is spending over women, but the fact that it is over rights and responsibility. So now, in modern age, where women go out to work, women are the breadwinners, and if you look at it in terms of rights and responsibility, then women too have the right over men because, they are the breadwinners. They are spending money in the domestic sphere, or they are spending money, and because of that particular responsibility, then they have the right. So I think this is a very much a very contested kind of a verse, but unfortunately it has been interpreted more dominantly in a very, very expensive way to show that generally, women cannot be leaders of men because, of this particular verse. Next, I think this is another very, very problematic verse that most scholars use, again, to deny women in politics or women in leadership position. For example, there is this verse that says, set up 2 witnesses from your own men, and if there are not 2 men, then choose a man and 2 women as witnesses, so that if one makes a mistake, then the other can remind her. This has been taken by most scholars by saying that, women are not credible, women do not have enough intelligence, that you need, two women witness to equal one man. Again, this has been very much interpreted in a very expansive manner, that on the whole, women cannot be judges, women cannot be religious leaders because they lack that credibility, they lack that intelligence, they lack the talent, for example. But I think it's very important for us to understand that if you look at the Quran and the verses, you must also understand the context by which the verses have been revealed, must understand the particularities of the situation, and do not, use this to justify universal attributes, for example, for women. So this particular verse was in fact revealed during a time when there was a commercial transaction taking place, and this commercial transaction take place in the period, during the Prophet's time, whereby it was quite a particular commercial transaction, whereby there was an advance payment, where you get your payment first, and then you get your goods 2 or 3 years later. And you may get your goods, agricultural goods, 2-3 years later at another place. So at that time, women were not very much part of that commercial network. Women were not traveling too much to be witnesses, for this particular transaction or that. But this verse was revealed to show that women could be witnesses, but perhaps because they were not used to the commercial transaction and they were not in that particular context, two women should be allowed or could be allowed to make certain comments to be witness for this commercial transaction, and in case, if one of them has forgotten because they were not very much part of that, commercial economic network, then you will have men. But again, this particular verse is not very much interrogated and is not questioned, and it has been used by most scholars to justify that, women could not be leaders. Other hadith, for example, for example, this one: those who entrust their affairs to a woman will never know prosperity, and never will succeed such a nation as makes a woman their ruler. So here again, you have very, very problematic hadith, for example. And again, this is where the particular is very much universalized to explain, the attributes of women and leadership. And if you look at the second one, never will succeed such a nation as makes a woman their ruler, this was related by an exegete who is very much dominant in the Muslim world. And it is stated that it was the time when the Prophet said, upon hearing what was happening in Persia, and there was a queen who succeeded her father, and therefore the nation would not prosper. Now, this is a particular context, but in another case, Fatima Mernisi has very much done studies on this. So this particular hadith was also not just from a particular context, but this particular hadith is said that perhaps it's very much a weak hadith because this particular context, or this particular words that were being mentioned by the Prophet was mentioned by a guy who was named Abu Bakr, and this particular person was actually punished by Caliph Umar for giving false testimony on a certain situation. So in that case, again, you can see here in terms of the hadith, there is a question in terms of how authentic, or how strong the hadith is. But without interrogating the hadith and the Quran and the verses, most of these have been taken as authoritative. Most of it is taken as absolute in order to understand and to justify women's position in politics. Now, here again, besides the Quran and Hadith, and this is where I get into my second part of my talk, when we look at Muslim history, Muslim tradition, and Muslim culture. Again, if you look at women on top, that is something that is seen as an aberration, and for some, like what I've mentioned just now, it's really seen as forbidden. But besides that, if you look at the tradition and history of Islam, there are other reasons as to why women are generally not seen to be able to lead or to be, heads of government or heads of state, for example. This is very much due to Aisha's legacy, that's the Prophet's wife, who led a battle against the fourth Caliph, Ali, and that was called the Battle of the Camel. And she was defeated in that battle. And that battle was very, very important in Muslim history because that splits the Muslims into the Sunni and the Shiite. So her legacy was seen very much as a negative one, and her legacy was always quoted in order to explain, that women should never be involved in politics. And if you look at other scholars, for example, Al-Ghazali and Al-Mawardi, they are scholars in Islamic jurisprudence, but also in Islamic political thought. Now, how do they explain leadership? They generally explain leadership which is very much male-centered, which is very much attributed to maleness. For example, the ability to be a good warrior, the ability to, be a good horseman, for example. And according to Al-Mawardi, women, as a result of, they being created, from the rib of Adam, and they have less intelligence, for example, but women from holding even subordinate positions such as vizier or a judge. So basing on all this kind of interpretation, I think it is no wonder, and it is quite understandable that Muslims themselves and also those in the West see, generally women are not only subordinated, but women are not allowed to be leaders in Islam. But of course, there are exceptions, and I think this is what I mean that we need to interrogate the verses, we need to interrogate the hadith, and we need to give the other story, which is not very much heard, and is very much marginalized, I think, in Muslim history and also in current discourse. I think we hear a lot about men leaders and also women leaders, but in modern times and in secular countries. For example, I think it's a good achievement for women today. 2 women, Muslim women, are elected in American Congress. They are from Michigan and Minnesota. And more women are becoming leaders in the secular world. But you do have women leaders. So how do you explain then women leaders? And are they an aberration? Are they marginalized? Are they sort of one-off in history? So you do have prime ministers, heads of state and heads of government in Muslim states, for example, some of this. By show of hands, would you know all the prime ministers that are shown here, or the heads of government? By show of hands, would you know like everybody? And I think maybe this will prove my point whether or not these women are very much known in the modern world, and I think they are not even known in the Muslim world, and what more sort of in the Western world. Here, I suppose. Oops, sorry. There is no. I mean. Maybe we have a little quiz, right? Sorry, I'm so sorry. This lady, maybe anyone from, where is she from, for example? Sorry? Oh, can't see the cursor. Okay, here. The second one from the left. Okay. Where is anyone? Okay, Bangladesh. Okay, for example, the one in the middle. So you have Benazir Bhutto from Pakistan, from Bangladesh, Hasina, and the third one, anyone? The third one? She's from Senegal. From Senegal. Her name is Mami Medior. And then the fourth one? Sibyl from Cyprus. And of course, I think everybody would know the lady right to the left, right? In this part of the world? Yes, Megawati, yeah. And then followed by Khalida Zia, yeah, Bangladesh. And then she's from Kosovo. Atifet from Kosovo. Amanita from Senegal. Amina from Mauritius. Tunsi Siller from Turkey. Mariam from Mali. She's from Zora from Kyrgyzstan. And of course, I think you should know this one. Halima Yaqub from Singapore. Yeah, just sort of elected. Yeah, so I think these women are very much marginalized, I think. And they are seen generally as aberration, or somehow they are exceptional, they are not part of that Muslim world, because, and their leadership is seen to be very, very problematic. As you can see, there was a lot of debate about whether or not Megawati could be president in 2001. And there were, two schools of thought and two factions saying on the one hand that, she can't be a leader just because she's a woman, not because of anything else. And in Islam, Islam forbids a woman from being a leader. She cannot be an imam, she cannot be a leader, so how could she be president? Okay, but later the other faction was able to show that, there's another tradition in the Muslim world and how you interpret the Quran and the Hadith. And as such, finally, and also a lot of politics going on as well. So Megawati was finally elected as the president in 2001. So I think we need to not only understand and not only know these women, but we need to reclaim women in Islamic history and tradition. And I think we need to interrogate the dominant negative understanding and assertions about women in Islam, which tend to silence or marginalize Muslim women who have played great roles in Muslim history. So I think aside from this, we need to know that a longer history, a longer perspective of Muslim history has been also, in a way, peppered by women rulers, women Muslim rulers. But they are generally not even known by Muslims themselves. So, for example, there were many queens in Muslim history and in Muslim tradition, and not only they were queens, but they were accepted as sovereigns because their name were minted on coins, and their names were also mentioned in the khutbah, which is the Friday sermon. These are the two symbols and the two criteria of women being accepted as legitimate in the eyes of the Muslim world, in the eyes of their own culture and their own tradition. And I think understanding this history and understanding this tradition is very important for Muslims today, and for women, Muslim women today, to know that there are other possibilities, there are other ways of imagining women, there are other realities that Muslim world should look at, and hopefully not only they are aware of this, but they are able to materialize these issues in the current world. So these are not modern women, they were in the past, in the ancient period, medieval period, and also in the pre-colonial period, but there were women rulers who were accepted in Islam and accepted by men in their society. For example, Sitt al-Mulk in the Fatimid dynasty, Shajarat al-Dur, again in Egypt, from the Mamluk dynasty, Sultana Radia from Delhi, and the Mongol queens. There were a few of the Mongol queens who ruled from the 9th century right up to about the 14th century. And I think this is very interesting because the culture, I would argue, the culture of Muslims in what you would call the periphery of Islam, not so much mainstream or mainland Islam. For example, the Mongols, those in Central Asia, and later on you can see Muslim women in this part of the world. But also, if you look at Sitt al-Mulk and also Shajarat al-Dur, they were Turks. They were not sort of Egyptians. So generally, most of these women were ruling in sort of the peripheral areas of Islam. And you also have Malika, Asma, and Arwa, Yemeni Arabs, but they are not from the Sunni tradition, but they are from the Ismaili Shi'i tradition. And you have women rulers in the Maldives in the 13th and 14th century, Sultana Khadija, Miriam, and Sultana Fatima. Now, more interesting also, which is really unknown, are women in this part of the world, besides those in the Middle East and in Egypt. You have Muslim queens in Pasai, in Patani, in Sukadana, in Jambi, in Solor, and in Aceh. How many of you have actually heard about these Muslim queens that were reigning during this period? Anybody? Aside from you who have read references. Yeah, so I think this really illustrates my point, that when you talk about Muslim women in Islam, you would never even associate Muslim women with, political leadership. So, and this is where, this is my research basically. I deal very much with Muslim queens, and my recent book is really a detailed analysis of Muslim queens in Aceh who ruled Aceh from 1641 to 1699. So maybe from a case study of this Sultanate, a case study from these Achenese queens, we will try to understand why was it possible Muslim women were able to be accepted by men in their society and accepted as female sovereigns, not only in the lens of culture and tradition, but also within Islam. So here you have four women rulers. Sultana Safiatuddin was the first ruler. She inherited the throne when her husband died in Aceh. And she was succeeded by three other women rulers, Nakiatuddin, Zakiatuddin, and Kamalat Shah. These are not photos of them, or these are imaginary artists' depiction of them, but they were real, certainly, and they ruled Aceh for almost 59 years. Independent, when Aceh was very much competing with the VOC and the EIC, the Dutch and the English Indies companies. So here, the question is how and why? Why were women able to rule, and why were women able to be accepted by men in society? Firstly, I think it is very much a negotiation between the adat and culture and religion, and the interpretation of the stakeholders, the interpretation of the religious elite, and the interpretation of the male elite at that time in terms of how they understood women. So here, for example, let me just elaborate a little bit more. If you look at what you call historical religious texts of the past in this part of the world, and in Aceh, for example, the Taj Salatin, the Advice for Kings, and this was a political treatise written in Aceh in 1603, and this was a treatise that was very much opposite to what I mentioned just now, what Al-Mawardi and Al-Ghazali mentioned, that a leader should have male attributes in terms of a leader should be powerful, a leader should be a horseman, a leader should be able to shoot arrows and so on and so forth. And in fact, the idea of a woman ruler or woman leader was unthinkable because it was not even discussed. But here, in this political treatise, it was very much discussed when and how you would actually allow a woman to rule. Of course, there are limitations, and you're looking at the context of the time, but I think what is important was that it was discussed and it was allowed. So it was stated that if there was no male heir, then a female should and could actually succeed a man, and that was accepted in this part of the world. And not only that, another treatise elaborate the situation of leadership and the attributes of leadership, and gender or sex did not matter at all. What would qualify a Muslim ruler to be a good one was basically the attributes, the moral attributes that he or she had, and that would be someone who would be just, very important, just, someone who was generous, loving, caring, pious, and exhorted her subjects to do good. So it's very much more the moral attributes of a leader, not so much whether it is about the sex of the person, or certainly it's not a gendered understanding of leadership. And for example, other treaties, other Islamic religious, political theories and also texts also state that, again, here, the idea of leadership is very much not gendered. What you see is that, you would see the positive attributes of a person. The person should be courageous, wise, loving, truthful, and most important is to be submissive to God. So again here, the idea of sex and gender did not play a part. Again, there's another hikayat, which is, in a way, you would say, hikayat would be stories, traditional stories in the Malay world, which talks about leadership. And this is another very important hikayat Patani, as you know, what I mentioned just now. Patani also had 4 female rulers from the 16th century up to the 17th century. So it also states that, a Raja or ruler should exhibit excellent manners and speak in graceful and sweet way. Again, not so much in terms of the gender. So generally, if I go back to the question that I asked just now, what made it possible for women to be on top, for women to be rulers, for women to be accepted as sovereigns in Muslim societies? Generally, I think you can look at the idea of the cultural, traditional, and the normative values where some of these societies had, whereby gender relations are very much more complementary. It's not so much hierarchical. And if you look at what I've mentioned just now, like Egypt, and Yemen, for example, and Patani, Aceh, most of this Central Asia, the Mongols, for example, the Mongol women were very much part and parcel of the male elites, and they took on leadership position. It is very much that complementary understanding of gender relations. Another very important reason is a non-gendered interpretation of leadership position, where criteria of leadership is based on lineage, not so much on the sex or gender, knowledge and moral attributes. So I think this is very is much more capacious and is much more expensive in terms of bringing women, into leadership position. But also, if you look at the treaties that were written by men, the interpretation of men of Hadith and Quran, and the acceptance and the support of the male elites is also another very important reason as to why women can be accepted as rulers or as leaders. And of course, generally, if you look at most of these queens, yes, some of them were not too successful, but generally they were, for example, in Patani, in Aceh, and Radia, for example, she was successful, although she met with a very tragic end. It was very much also the leadership and the political acumen and the expertise of these women themselves in enabling them to be leaders. So what I'll do now for this part of my talk is to sort of go back full circle from where we began just now by looking at women leadership from the lens of the Quran, and then we look at Muslim history. So I think it's very important for us to look at other verses in terms of understanding gender relations in Islam. Because if you look at the verses which concern men and women, there are many other numerous versions in the Quran that do not even allude to some sort of a subordinate position of men and women, but very much alluding to the issues of justice, the issue of egalitarianism, and also the issue of equality between men and women. So for example, this is just a quote first from Asma Barlas. The Quran does not use sex to construct ontological and sociological hierarchies that discriminate against women. The Quran certainly recognizes sexual specificity, but it does not assign gender symbolism. And if you look at other verses, for example, and the need for us to re-examine and to rehaul the whole women question, and to look at the understanding of the Quran and Hadith in a much more capacious way, based on Islamic ethos of justice, love, and complementarity. I think we could look at some of these other verses. For example, the Quran from the chapter Al-Ahzab. This verse states, those who have surrendered to God among males and females, those who believe among males and females, those who are sincere among males and females, those who are truthful among males and females, those who are patient among males and females, those who fear God among males and females, and those who give in charity among males and females, those who fast among males and females. I didn't repeat this, it's in the verse of Quran. Those who remember God among males and females, God has prepared for them forgiveness and great reward. So basically, it's really to show that yes, it's about male and female. It's not just about male, and I'm not talking about just male, and just referring to male in the Quran. And this is very interesting because why was this verse revealed in the first place? This verse was revealed very early during the period of the Prophet, when a woman, came by and asked the Prophet's wife, why is it that so far the verses that have been revealed are all about men? What about us? What about the women? And then, this verse was revealed, and this is where God says male and female, male and female, male and female, and say, basically, if you do good, and if you are just and if you are sincere, and you do good in society and you combat evil, you get similar rewards here and also in heaven. And again, another verse, there are many, but I just give you a few. Male believers, al-mu'minun, and female believers, al-mu'minat, are the natural partners. They are the awliya of each other, of one another, and they command the good and forbid wrong, and they perform prayer, give the obligatory alms, and obey God and His Messenger. And they are those upon whom God has mercy. Indeed, God is almighty and wise. So here again is very different from the ayat or the verse of al-Qawamun, that men are naturally superior, because in most of the verses it does not state that. So the interpretation of that verse, which is very much functional and it is very much within the domestic context of husband and wife, should not be universalized, into something that is, hierarchical, where men, of course, is the superior sex. So finally, I'd just like to conclude by saying that looking at the Quran and the Hadith, and you can say hermeneutics, for example. Hermeneutics will not be able to solve problems. There are serious structural problems, serious political problems, power relations that are out there. But I think looking at the Quran and the Hadith and understanding, a more complete picture, a more balanced picture, and knowing the Quran and the Hadith and the various interpretations of this, having a more liberating reading of the Quran and the Hadith, and interrogate those dominant kind of interpretation of the Quran, I think is a good start in terms of understanding women's positions and role. I think only with a liberating reading and being, in a more capacious kind of attitude, that you are able to treat women, existentially, in a way whether you degrade women or whether you liberate women. And I think that is very, very important. And not only that, I think what I've shown you just now, the long history of Islam and the culture and the tradition of Islam, which is very diverse, I think we should not talk about Islam and then, Islamic civilization. I think there are a lot of Islamic civilizations. There are different Islamic societies, there are different traditions, which is very diverse, very contested, and very plural. So understanding the other alternative, tradition and cultural and historical events where women experiences were very much part of sort of the way whereby women were not treated as subordinate, whereby women were treated as leaders, and women were able to be leaders. I think it's a very important tradition that we need to bring in today for us to understand women's position today and to interrogate this kind of what I mentioned just now, where I started off, these absolutists and this very, very authoritarian understanding of what is called Islam, and how women should be treated in Islam today. And I think with that, thank you very much.